My introduction will be guided by that information. Mickey's work is radical and transformative. In pioneering work in the 80s using novices and experts, she demonstrated the fundamental importance of internal conceptual representation, in particular domain-specific knowledge structures for problem solving and memory and learning. While her most cited work compares differences between how experts and novices conceptualize and solve physics problems, Mickey mentioned an underappreciated study in which she took a young boy, and a single domain, dinosaur knowledge. She drew upon ideas for representing semantic knowledge from the LNR work at UCSD, which she taught herself so she could model the boy's knowledge. The R in LNR is, of course, Dave Rumelhart. Mickey compared the child's representation of dinosaurs he knew well to those he knew less well. She showed that the conceptual structures differed and knowledge representations predicted recall. Individual differences were controlled, so one can't invoke procedural knowledge or strategies as an explanation for expertise effects. It's really the conceptual structures. This work shows another quality of Mickey as a scientist. She's intrepid. If she needs to learn a skill, she acquires it, and along the way, she makes a fundamental contribution. Mickey also highlighted the central role that the activities of the learner, initially self-explanation, play in conceptual change. These themes continue in her important work in the ICAP framework, which we'll hear about in less than 2 minutes. Now, studying conceptual representations and the processes that create and transform representations requires tackling complex methodological challenges, including how do you access and code the knowledge and the process of constructing it. Mickey's met these challenges with ambitious methodological innovations that are being increasingly adopted by others, including work by Mickey and those she has influenced on designing, implementing, and evaluating theory-driven curricula in the classroom. Given the impact of this work, we could simply honor her as a pioneer for the foundation she's built. But Mickey's still pushing the envelope. Her ICAP work identifies interactive, collaborative construction of representations during learning as the gold standard. But how to create, measure, and understand interactive collaboration is one of the least well understood problems in our field, one people in pragmatics, actually, an area I know something about, shy away from. And that's the problem that she's tackling in her current work. Finally, there's an aspect of Mickey's science that I'm struggling to articulate that comes through in her paper. So here's my clumsy attempt. Mickey builds and implements theories and models that integrate and synthesize concepts from multiple fields, both theoretical and applied, and that also introduce conceptual change in those fields. How does she do it? Well, first, she's a master at extracting the essence without getting lost in irrelevant details. ICAP is a lovely example of this. We'll hear about it. Second, she simplifies complex constructs, but is explicit about when and why she's doing so. This means her theories are simple and rigorous, but never simplistic. Second, and this is what I struggle with articulating, she's transformative without being confrontational. Even in her early papers that argued that procedural learning, the focus of many of her mentors, was the bathwater, with the baby being the content of conceptual representations, she included quotes that showed that those whose approaches she found misguided had indeed acknowledged the importance of representation. This collaborative, non-confrontational approach maximizes the likelihood of introducing conceptual change when she introduces constructs that transform standard ideas and approaches. For example, showing how vague ideas like deep versus shallow learning or active versus passive learning are subsumed by more rigorous, well-defined constructs. So, without further ado, I give you Mickey Chi.
It's the moment of truth. This beautifully handcrafted bronze medal weighs about 37 pounds. But you get to wear it for at least the first 10 seconds. If it doesn't tip you over.
It is heavy.
And we also have. Okay. Where's that photographer that's supposed to be here? Oh, well, somebody snap a picture. Okay, well, here's your... All right. Congratulations, Vicki.
Oh, I can hardly see. Okay. It's always a question whether you should talk about a lot of your, summarize your past work or talk about your current work. And I decided that I think I better just talk about the work I've been doing for the last 8 or 9 years. And then I couldn't choose which one I wanted to do because I have 3 very active projects that I really like. I like them all. I just want to tell you what the first, well, briefly tell you what the first 2 are. So the first one is a new theoretical explanation for science misconceptions across all types of science concepts. And in particular, it's concepts of processes, whereas psychologists have studied mostly concepts of entities. So what I wanted to explain for this project is why we perceive, for example, a straight line in ants foraging, whether or not it's the same mechanism causing perceiving a straight line as the appearance of wolf hunting for prey. So students seem to think that these 2 kinds of processes are the same, and they get confused and they get misconceptions. Anyway, that's the basis of that work, and the source of that misconception is what I call collective causality versus sequential causality. I actually prepared a talk to give on that topic, but I think it's just too hard to get it across. The second project was actually triggered by some of the work that Schober and Clark did many years ago, in which they think that a bystander cannot understand the conversation that 2 people are involved in, a bystander who's not communicating with the 2 people. And it's also inspired by some of the work by Keith Stenning. And what we've developed is the idea that by observing tutorial videos, the bystander or the observing student can actually learn a lot more than observing the same tutor giving a monologue or didactic explanations. Everything is held the same. So that's another project we're working on. So finally, I'm going to talk about the ICAP project because it's lasted the longest time. And in the slides, I'll have abbreviations like S is for student, T for teachers, R for researchers, Q for questions, and K for knowledge. So there's quite a bit of consensus and concern out there that educational research has made very little impact. So for example, Schneider, who's the director of IES, said in 2018 that too few educators feel that research that the U.S. government supports on improving student learning has any tangible impact on their work in the classrooms. And that's something that has to change. So IES sponsored a report convening a panel of experts. The names are shown below. I'm sure you know who they are, know them. And they distilled a whole bunch of empirical data and distilled what are really robust findings out there for the last few decades. So after decades of research, they distilled 7 principles that have robust data. However, only 6 of them has moderate to strong evidence, and they're shown above. Many people talk about them. Spaced learning over time, use quizzes to re-expose students to key content, interleave work example solutions with problems, combine graphics with verbal descriptions, connect and integrate abstract and concrete representations of concept, use prompts and deep questions to elicit students' explanations. So I categorize what these 6 things are, and one of them, the first 2 is about how to enhance memory. The third one is about how to design instructional activities for students. The 4th and 5th one is about how to teach with respect to 2 forms of information, and the last one is how to elicit students' explanations. So these are actually 6 very specific and discrete and somewhat random recommendations, I would say, without sufficient prescription details for classroom instruction. For example, how do you generate deep questions? So the lack of coherence is also evident in the literature per se. For example, a given intervention is often contrasted in several ways in the literature. I'm going to use self-explaining as an example. And these 7, I just randomly chose 7 that are listed in chronological order. So self-explaining is just a strategy where as you read or listen, you sort of try to make sense or explain it to yourself. So in 1994, we showed that self-explaining while reading and prompted to do so is better than rereading the same text twice. Second study showed that self-explaining text sentences is better than repeating sentences. The third study showing that studying incomplete examples is better than studying completed example. The fourth is study self-explaining worked-out example by selecting responses from a menu is better than studying the example only. And the fifth study showed explaining other people's solutions better than watching other people's solution, and so on. And explaining with a partner is better than explaining by yourself. So if you were a teacher, you wouldn't know which is better. Is selecting response from menu better than studying incomplete examples? There's really no guidelines from these sets of studies. And this is not just for self-explanation. This is true for lots and lots of intervention. Here's a second example on concept mapping, which happens to be an activity that teachers like to use. There's multiple contrasting conditions. I won't read them all. Just read, let's say, the second one. Copying mapping is better than reading map. Collaboratively building is better than individually. Collaboratively building maps is the same effect as collaboratively building maps with 2 extra resources. Correcting concept map is better than reading maps, and so on and so forth. Generating the links and notes better than selecting notes and link. So again, teachers won't know which one is better and why do you sometimes get null effects. So our work aims to provide some coherence in the literature on how to enhance students' learning by understanding first how students learn, then translate our findings into directing how teachers might teach. This is what's called a student-centered approach or bottom-up approach versus researchers deciding how teachers should teach. So how do students learn? By engaging cognitively with instructional materials while reading a text, listening to lectures, watching videos, solving problems, studying example, answering questions, and so forth. There's lots of ways. So cognitive engagement broadly refers to thinking as opposed to there's a lot of work on emotional engagement, behavioral engagement, and so on. But we can't see how students are thinking, either in a classroom or even remotely. So cognitive engagement has been defined in the following 2 ways. First, it's been defined as students either being on task or off task, which is detected either physically or by probing in laboratory studies where they stop reading and say, what are you thinking about? Or now they have data mining techniques. So on task is paying attention, and off task is goofing off. Now goofing off or off task is very easily detectable by physical behavior. They're really not on task. And therefore, it's obvious that on task has got to be better than off task. So a lot of people work on mind wandering, are you off task or on task? Another way to define cognitive engagement is active learning versus passive learning. Both are parts of on-task behavior. So active learning, on the other hand, is defined by whether the teacher or instructor is lecturing or not lecturing, okay? So they're defining how students learn by what teachers do. And anyway, again, there's no question that active learning might be better than passive learning, because in passive learning, students just sits there and pay attention, whereas in active learning, students could be doing a lot of things, solving problems, group work, concept mapping, watching videos, any number of those things. So the most persuasive evidence to show that active learning is better than passive learning is a meta-analysis of 225 studies in college STEM classrooms, STEM in science, by Freeman. It was published by Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so it got a lot of recognition. So what it showed is that not only is active learning much improved students' learning by almost half a standard deviation, but it also reduced failure rates, it closed gender gaps, it did a lot of good things. So the problem with defining engagement from either physical detection of goofing off or paying attention, probing or data mining techniques of mind wandering, or instructor lecturing, not lecturing, is that there's no prescription. And what I mean by that is that those findings doesn't translate to telling teacher what should they do when students mind wanders. What should they do when the instructors are not lecturing? So if the instructors are not lecturing, should the students watch video or concept mapping? So the prescription is just not clear. Our work addresses the lack of prescription and the lack of coherence by providing a framework called ICAP that breaks down active learning into 3 additional modes. So we call it interactive, constructive, active, and passive. So the 3 modes is subsumed under active learning, and the passive is subsumed under passive. And we will italicize all verbs because to differentiate it, like the word active differentiated from active learning. So the outline of this talk is we're going to first talk about the ICAP theory that has clear operational definition, show the theory's predictions and supporting evidence from the literature, and show how we translate our theory into practice in 2 attempts, ICAP Study 1, ICAP Study 2. So in the ICAP theory, we propose that on-task engagement itself, not off-task, can also be indicated by visible behavior. And in fact, you could differentiate the visible behavior and by the product content. So the output a student produces and how it actually differs from the instructional materials is what I mean by the product content. For example, what's the difference between the instructional notes versus the student's notes? Each indicator can be used alone, sometimes as adequate, but both of them jointly usually is very adequate and get sort of confusing or ambiguity. And most importantly, these indicators can also serve as prescriptive guidelines. So let's go through the 4 behavior modes and see if you're convinced that they're differentiable. So ICAP proposes that on-task engagement can not only be detected physically by visible behaviors, but can be discriminated into 4 behavior modes. So for these 4, you would probably agree everybody's on task. But this one is paying attention, this one is measuring, this one's drawing concept map, and this one's comparing ideas, justifying, arguing. So I'm going to give the example of each mode in the context of a lot of classroom activities, and we'll define and differentiate them by both the visible behavior and the student product. So what is the passive mode? It's really paying attention. It's an attentive behavior. Students are paying attention, oriented toward, and receiving instruction, but they're not doing anything else overtly or producing anything. So examples are you're listening, watching video, observing, reading, studying, a worked out example, and you're producing nothing. Now, there's no question that sometimes you could be thinking good thoughts, and people like you guys might be thinking good thoughts, but I'm saying in general, if the students are just paying attention, 90% of the time, or whatever, higher proportion, they're not thinking about the instructional materials. In the active mode, it's really a form of manipulating material. So you're paying attention and you're physically manipulating the instructional materials, but not adding any new information. So for example, if you're copying the solution from the board, the solution steps are already provided, so you're not providing anything new, right? If you're underlining sentences, the sentence is already in the text, so that's not new. If you're selecting an option or icon, you're choosing one available icon from all the choices, and moving sliders as locations provided, and so on. It's very easy to operationally define these. So the constructive mode is generating behavior that you're actually producing some additional information that may contain small pieces of knowledge that's new with respect to the instructional materials, or going beyond what was presented in the materials, literally. So this is, again, easy to detect. If you're drawing a concept map or diagram that wasn't in the text, that's new. Of course, if you're providing explanations, that's new. If you're posing questions, the questions are new. You're comparing, contrasting similarities and differences, those are new, and so on. Now note, we're not talking about, in the constructive case, you're not discovering new principles or laws and major laws for the domain. So some people misunderstand what constructive means. In my sense, it could be constructing something very little. So in the interactive mode, refer to collaborating with a peer, in which a person is generating and building on not just your own, but other person's contribution in a mutually co-generative or co-constructive way. Notice that interacting with a learning environment or a system is not necessarily interactive in this sense or collaborative. So there's also a misunderstanding there. That is, when interacting with a system, you could only be selecting from an icon, which would just be active. Okay? So again, if you debate, you create some new products when you're discussion. So the summary is simply what I just said. The labels are interactive, constructive, active, passive, behaviors as shown, and the content and outputs is very clear. You either extend beyond not only instructional information, but your partner's contribution, or you just extend beyond your own, or else your content is identifying part of the instruction or there's no products. So this is very clear definitions. So definition of engagement, as I already said, is based on overt behavior, content of the product. So it's not behavioral engagement, which refers to, there are work on that. Behavioral engagement refers to how often kids attend classes, how often they do homework, and so on. Since cognitive engagement refers to thinking, what cognitive processes are involved in each mode? Suppose we just speculate that there are 4 elementary knowledge change processes. I call them knowledge change processes because when you're learning, you're actually changing your knowledge, right? So suppose we contemplate these 4: storing new piece of knowledge, activating prior knowledge, linking new knowledge with prior knowledge, linking prior knowledge with prior knowledge. You can link all kinds of stuff. Or you can infer from prior knowledge, link with new, and so on. So let's envision how these processes might play out for each ICAP mode. So in the first mode, suppose you have a text and your engagement material, engagement behavior, you're just reading only. So you're really doing nothing overtly while reading or listening to a lecture. So the new information is directly stored in an isolated way. It's not linked with any prior knowledge. You might be linked with each other, but not with any prior knowledge. So your knowledge base could be isolated, or what Whiteheaders call inert, right? So it's good for immediate recall, and it may be good in specific recall when the specific context is provided. In the second case, in active mode, you might be highlighting while you're reading. So highlighting some sentences costs more attention to be paid to those sentences. So you're focusing on those sentences, and what that does is allow you to activate prior knowledge related to what you're reading, what you're highlighting. So you're activating prior knowledge. So then you might link new incoming knowledge with the activated prior knowledge. So the knowledge base is activated and more gaps are filled. It's strengthened and more complete. So that's the outcome of your learning. So cognitively, it allows you for faster and better recall. In the constructive mode, you're not only reading, highlighting, but you're taking notes, right? And so you're writing down the similarity differences, comparing and contrasting. So you're activating prior knowledge, link new knowledge with old knowledge, and you're inferring similarities and differences, the I and the Y nodes, and then you write that down. So you're basically inferring upon your own knowledge. So you get a more elaborate schema and deeper learning. So I want to add some clarification for the constructive mode before we go on to the interactive one. So because the constructive mode involves the process of inferring, so you're just inferring a small piece of knowledge that goes beyond information, as I already said. So this is, you don't have to be high knowledge, and everybody can infer. So this is different from the word constructive that's used generally out in the literature, meaning a constructive approach. So I mean constructive as an inference mechanism. And also, the inferred knowledge is not novel to the domain, right? So being constructive does not mean you have to derive the principles and laws. So sometimes in education, people misinterpret that to be something you got to invent, essentially. The third point is that the same piece of knowledge can result in different inferences. That is, two different people can generate different inferences from the same piece of knowledge. And that the inferences can even be incorrect from the normative perspective. And that's not a problem because you could encounter correct information later, and that conflict actually causes more learning. And if you do this generation continuously, it'll lead to deeper learning. I'll show that in a minute. So being generative or constructive does not necessarily mean that you must work in a complex task, such as problem learning or problem-based learning. So a lot of people think, oh, I got to do constructive task. It's going to be a big task, like something they have to design, take them forever. Okay, so deeper learning from constructive activity, like self-explaining, all I mean by that is that it can be measured in several ways. So this is just a graph showing people who are high-frequent explainers who do a lot of construction when we prompt them versus low-frequent explainers, people who do less. And what happens, what I mean by deeper learning is that the high-frequent explainers are much better at answering the harder questions when they're not actually much better in the shallow or easy verbatim questions. So they excel, and particularly in the harder questions. And they can also do things like, they can infer right here, 10.5 out of 11 omitted function information when trying to learn a system like the circulatory system. Usually understand the function information is very difficult, but high-frequency learners can infer a lot of them, whereas low-frequency learner won't infer as much. This is just an example of how you measure deeper learning, and that's what I mean by being constructive. Okay, let's go to the interactive mode. So here's two people collaborating in dialogues while they're reading and taking notes and being constructive already. So what happens is that each partner builds on their own knowledge first, so they can generate inferences X, and they can articulate inference X. The inference X can then be encoded by the other partner, Romy, and then Romy can generate another inference based on the linking the inference the other person generated with some prior knowledge that this person, Romy, already has, and Romy then articulates Y, and Y can be assimilated or encoded by Rishi and linked with his prior knowledge and generate Z. So what you end up with is that the Y and the Z are new knowledge that generated that neither partner could generate on their own, right? But they could generate together. So the cognitive outcome is more innovative and perhaps newer perspective. So a few more clarification of collective mode of the process of co-infer. So the advantage of collaboration is not necessarily that your partner has complementary knowledge. That's a common view. Rather, the advantage of collaboration is in the inferring process. Because each partner may generate a different inference, even from an identical piece of knowledge, the advantage of collaboration is that you can infer new knowledge based on the inferences your partner generated. So the wild card is what a partner infers that you didn't infer. So we can also use ICAP as a lens, turns out, to analyze dialogue patterns, which we didn't discover till later into our first project. And it turns out if you use ICAP as a lens, there are many, many non-co-constructive dialogue patterns. So for example, the first one is not even interactive. Two people, we call it parallel play. Each person can do their own thing. They could be passive or active, each person. Second one, also no interaction. They're cooperating, divide and conquer. The third one is interactive, but one partner dominates. And another common form is they are interactive, but both partners are doing active work, not constructive. And so out of these patterns, only one pattern out of perhaps 12 are actually interactive in a co-constructive way. So it's very difficult to achieve. So to relate to the theme of this conference, ICAP predicts that creativity is most likely to be achieved in collaboration if co-inferring dialogue occurs. But it is only one of a dozen, so it's difficult to achieve. So based on what I'm saying, we now have entertain and speculate the content processes and what the knowledge changes might be from those content processes, and that generates a hypothesis that interactive learning is better than constructive, better than active, and better than passive. And moreover, to clarification, is that there's probably more difference, a bigger gap between the two higher modes and two lower modes, referred to as deeper learning and shallow learning. And the other important point that is missed sometimes is that the prediction is for relative difference between modes. Within a mode can be substantial learning differences depend on the task. So this is something Kirsten Butcher mentioned today. So you could have different constructive tasks. Some have a lot more process, require a lot more process than others, and there might be difference that ICAP is not making those predictions. So the second outline is going to show the theory's predictions and supporting evidence from the literature, so you can understand how I mapped these studies in the literature to the ICAP modes. Let me just go ahead with the first one. So one recent example I start using, because it's with a very young age group, is this one by Christine Laguerre, Tanya Lombrazzo. So preschoolers, I think they were 5-year-olds, were shown 5 interlocking gears, a crank that turns the fan. These were 2 groups. So one group was asked to watch, look at this, and the experimenter turned the crank for 40 seconds. The second group, the explain group, is asked to tell me how this works while we're turning the crank for 40 seconds. I mean, there's no feedback. The student is just supposed to, the child's supposed to just tell them how the child thinks the things work, right? There's no feedback. So what is the learning measure? Which is to see how well each child can reconstruct the causal functional relationship between the crank and the gears to allow the machine to work. Okay, very simple, clean study. Here's what they found and how we map it to ICAP. So on the left hand, so this is the column where, that's the explaining group, okay? So the frequency of correct explanation by the explaining group is much higher than the one for the watch group. And then for study 2, the second result, among the explaining group, some kids explain and other kids just describe the cranking device. And when that happens, within the explain condition, the people who try to articulate a causal explanation was much better than the children who only describe. So we would map that to constructive is better than active, and this one's constructive better than passive. Okay, so this is just an example how we take studies in the literature and map them to the ICAP modes. So there's lots of pairwise comparisons we can use in the literature from all kinds of studies. And so the first condition is on the left, the second condition is the top, and we just take all these studies and see whether, so they should, for example, as conditions active, it should be better than passive. If it's constructive, it should be better than active, and so on, right? So instead of showing you all of the studies in the literature that maps onto this, let me just go back to the 2 sets of literature I showed before, the one on self-explaining, the 7 studies in self-explaining that had random comparison. Now these comparisons now all totally make sense in this graph, right? So, so self-explaining a work example by selecting response from a menu is better than passive. A studying example only because this is active, this is passive. This is passive. Studying incomplete example which is constructive, because if it's incomplete, you're going to have to supply to make it complete. It's better than studying a complete example, which you don't have to supply anything. So that's constructive versus passive. Explaining with others is interactive, is better than watching. Self-explaining is better than repeating, because self-explaining is constructive, and this is active. Explaining with a partner is better than doing it alone. So that's how we fit the studies. And we're doing the same thing with, you can do exactly the same thing with concept mapping, right? So correcting concept mapping is better than reading a text. Concept mapping from generating nodes and link is better than concept mapping from selecting nodes and link, right? Because selecting is only active. So now if a teacher wants to use concept mapping, they can have a sense of which 2 conditions, they can try. They can one day try correcting concept map, another day they can try something different, like generating nodes. So here's a study in the literature that actually compared 3 conditions. So this is a paper by Gobert and Clement back in 1999. So read is the first column. If they're just reading, that's passive. Describing second, drawing is third. And this is 2 kinds of results for both dynamic assessment and static. Finally, in our own lab, we have tried it with college engineering students. This is work funded by NSF, where we compare 4 conditions. Now, we didn't want to compare text with reading and drawing text because a lot of those studies have been done. We wanted to make it even more difficult. So for 2 of the conditions, all the students had was text. So they read text about elastic modulus concept, which is passive, or they read text and underlined it. Or in this 3rd and 4th condition, they were only given a diagram where they had to explain what is the relationship between metal A's, B, C. So they explain the construction condition, and then the last one, they just explain jointly. So notice what happens here is that in the red box, we actually gave them the answer. For the first 2 condition, people gave them the answer, whereas the 3rd and 4th people had no answers. And we've got the results where passive, active, underlining, constructive, explain jointly. So we got systematically increasing improvement for each condition. Okay, so summary of what I've said so far for part 1 and part 2, we have the taxonomy with operational definitions, and this is for absolute, not for absolute categorization of tasks. There could be some that falls in between, okay? People sometimes often ask me, what about this task? Well, it doesn't have to be absolute. The hypothesis also predicts the relative levels of learning in this decreasing order. We've shown evidence, it's generalizable, applicable to all topics and age. So the caveat is that interactive is better than constructive only if collaborative interaction and co-constructive, which is difficult to achieve. And paying attention now in this framework is the lowest form of engagement despite what's commonly misconceived. So for example, this cartoon says, Einstein, stop fooling around, pay attention. That's what teachers think. Okay, outline. The 3rd, I'm going to talk about 2 attempts to translate this theory into practice. So a theory with robust evidence surely should be translated to practice, you would think. But how? This is not something I've ever done or knew how to do. So the majority of the classroom implementation research takes 1 or 2 approaches. One approach is what we call pull-out studies. That is, you interface directly with the students. You give them a tutoring system, for example. Or you implement a very specific intervention by the teachers. That interleave problem with work example, you teach the teacher how to do this and do specific. But for a full-blown effort in translating a theory into classroom practice, we propose that you need 12 components. Here are the 12. So the top row of the 12, the R is researchers, T is teachers, student, S is student. The top row shows what each group of people do. First of all, you got 3 groups of people, a minimum, besides administrators and all that. So first you have to develop a theory. Then you have to develop, the researchers to develop ways to teach the teachers about your theory or your phenomena, whatever. That's called PD, professional development. The teachers then have to design lesson plans. Teachers have to implement or teach the lesson plans. The students have to enact how the activities you assign to them, and then the students have to learn, okay? So if these were the things you have to do, this is what else the researchers have to do. You also have to develop evidence for your theory. You have to develop assessment for how well this PD, how well teachers understood it. You have to develop assessment for how well they design lesson plans, develop assessment for how well they implement, develop assessment for how students enact them, and then develop assessment for learning. So it's a huge amount of work, right? It's not a simple lab study. So we're gonna, so the most amount of time taken is really developing the PD as a start, right? Because you don't know how to explain it. You have to explain your theory to teachers, instructors. So this is what we did for this first study. Since we already developed a theory, we already have evidence for theory, we're done with the first column, but we still have 10 more columns to do, right? We develop everything here in the red. And what I want to show you is that some of these things are challenges that has not been worked on yet. So we went into this study even knowing we had challenges that we hope we will uncover as we do our study. So we develop all those things. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how teachers design the improved lesson plans. So this is essentially the design of the study. We had 13 K-12 teachers. We recruited 50 or more, but it always dribbled down to far fewer. The teachers learn about ICAP from an online PD that we develop, and then they modify their own lessons. So let's walk through. Each teacher can teach either one or two, let's say 2 topics. Most of them teach 2. So for each topic, they design one test for 2 lessons. They have designed an active lesson and an interactive lesson. Let me not do that then. Each lesson plan then contains, let me just say that again. Each lesson was designed or intended by the teacher to be in a specific ICAP mode. So they could say, I want an active lesson class and I want an interactive lesson class. Then for each active lesson or each lesson plan, they have at least 3 activities for that one class, right? So for a 50-minute class, you have at least on average 3 activities. And for this interactive lesson, they also have 3 activities. Next, I'm going to show you an example of the activities the teacher designed intended for one class versus the other. So here we are. Here's 2 contrasting activities. One is designed intended for an active class, that's active card sorting. Okay, we would call that an active task. The other one is intended for an interactive class that, they want 2 people to work together to write down what the proportions are. So for each study, we're going to just report 3 studies, not to overload you. And we're going to talk about how we develop assessment for lesson design, because that's really novel, hasn't been done before, and of course the learning results. That's what everybody wants to know. So the first challenge, which I said no one has done before, is how do you assess teachers' design of 65 lessons, varied activity types, grade levels, topics? It was very difficult to figure out. A conventional way might be just to evaluate the 65 lesson plan and assigning ICAP mode. Well, we did do that, but it's very time consuming. So is there a faster way, less subjective, has potential for scaling up and prescriptive? So here's our insight. It turns out we were thinking about this. The only common source of data across all lesson plans are the instructional directives for the activities. What I mean by instructive directive, so here, the verb directives, it says fill in, right? Fill in. And the one on the right says, with your partner, create. So those are the instructional directives. They're within little verb clauses. And that's the only thing common among all these things, right? It's instructional directives. So we figured out that we could code the verb directives within their instruction. It turns out of a sample of 111 verbs, half of them, 58, were just to be manipulated active verbs. So we can code by imagining what subjects are asked to do. And this, you will agree with me, I think. Choose, copy, identify, label, match. They're all active verbs. So this examples would be label the triangle like the following, measure out that thing. Even without context, we can more or less determine the mode of a verb for most of them. Occasionally, a context is needed. I'll show you one. They use less than half as many generative or constructive verbs, 27 versus 58. So things like come up with, compare, connect. So connect is one of the few ones that need context. You could say connect to knows, which would be active, whereas connect to ideas would be constructive, right? So teachers might say, use information your team gathered yesterday to generate a ratio chart. And so that's how we code the verb in there. Use supplies provided to create a model protein. Then, surprisingly, we weren't expecting this. They used very few collaborative interactive verbs, only 9 of them. And of these 9, at best, only 1 we could say has a chance of being co-constructive. So they say share the results with your group. So what I just want to show you 3 results, right? So the first result is teachers use a large number of active verbs. We already show that. But were they accurate? In other words, were the verb directives appropriate for the mode of the class? So here, the first column is an active class. They intended it to be active class. And blue shows manipulative or active activities. So they were pretty accurate. 100% would be totally accurate, but they were almost 80%. So for an active class, they were able to accurately generate active activities, manipulative activities. For constructive class that they meant to, only about, in this red, a little bit over 50% of the activities are actually constructive, and for the interactive, only 7%. So they're very accurate for active classes and very inaccurate for interactive classes, and mediocre for the middle. Okay, then learning outcomes. So for learning outcome, we had to pull all the constructive classes, pull all the interactive classes, and there were significant differences in learning. We had to ignore the interactive classes because they weren't designed properly. So we just want to talk about how did the teachers misunderstand the interactive mode? This is something we're just going back to the data to look at. So there's 3 significant ways that teachers misunderstand interaction. The first column shows 56% of the time, teachers tend to pair students on active activity. So active, right? They're collaborating, but they're just active. The second one, 13%, they tend to pair them for parallel work. And finally, the 39 to 40%, they simply ask students to work in groups. So they really don't understand collaboration very well. For the study 2, I'm going to be fast with this. We're going to focus more on teachers' implementation, and we ablated many components for various reasons. So I'm going to talk about the design, how we developed the assessment and the learning results. So the main difference is in this second one, we had a face-to-face PD. So 7 teachers ended up participating, 1,400 students, even though we recruited many, many more teachers. The baseline data this study is slightly different. The control group is how the teachers taught the year before, okay, with their students. But the beauty of this design is that we have the exact same pre-test process for the control group and for everybody, because the researchers and the teachers designed the lesson plan. So everybody taught from the same lesson plan. Okay, so here's the results. Again, we got significant differences in learning gains, okay, pre and post test. Now, the second challenge I want to talk about, how do we assess teachers' implementation in the classroom from videos? What is a common source of data? We have exactly the same problem. What is the common source of data? So we decided that how they ask questions will be a common source of data that occurs in all classes, regardless of topic and grade level. So turns out we could code the quality of teachers' questions by ICAP modes. There you go again. So passive question is a rhetorical question to emphasize a point. The teachers answer the questions themselves usually and doesn't expect to respond. Things like, so where's the gene? It's on the chromosome, right? Or does that make sense? An interactive question would be very few of them. So we only consider opportunities given to collaborate by the teacher or asking one student to respond to another student's comment. It doesn't occur very often. So active questions are things that teacher asks students to recall information from previously taught materials, provide facts from background knowledge, or basically you don't need to draw inferences. So examples are, who remember what we talked about yesterday? What's the relationship between the prey and the predator? What is the color of lava? Okay. Constructive questions, of course, would be answers that requires answers that have not been provided in the lesson or the instructional materials. What will happen to the mice that have the mutation described in the text? Which parts of the desert environment would be useful for a dark mouse to hide in? Why do you think that's the case? Okay, so it's very clear from our operation definition what kind of question is which mode. So notice that our definition of a deep question is merely one that elicits constructive response based on ICAP of providing information that's not already presented. This is an easy prescription to follow. In the IES practice guide, deep question is defined as those that focus on the underlying causal and explanatory principles. That's a daunting definition. Teachers could not develop deep assessment questions for the materials they're teaching in our early efforts. In fact, this is before we thought about ICAP ourselves. So we just told them, okay, design hard questions, questions that students couldn't answer. They could do that, but hard is not necessarily deep. So another conventional approach to explain deep questions in contrast to ICAP is to suggest using question stems like why, what caused X, how did X occur, what if, and so on. But according to ICAP, using question stems does not guarantee that the information asked has not been presented. So it may not actually be deep, right? So to assess the implementation from videos of teacher teaching, we compare the changes in the mode of question asked during baseline year, which is the red, and intervention year, which is the blue. And this is interactive. Okay, there's a little bit more change. But a significant change, even though a small amount, for constructive question, 19.5 over 8, hardly any changes in active questions, and a decrease in passive questions, so that's good. So they did change. They did improve on the constructive and decrease the passive question, but made no changes in the active. To see whether this amount of interactive constructive question might have accounted for the learning improvement, we simply correlated the total number of constructive interactive questions for, with students' learning score for each section that the teacher teaches in both the baseline year and the intervention year. Basically, this correlation is very high, 0.44 significant, and it basically says that the ICAP prediction is upheld. That is, a class that has more interactive constructive question clearly led to more learning. It could have accounted for the overall improvement in students' learning that we showed earlier. Okay, so to summarize, I want to compare study 1 and 2 with just one slide. We want to look at teachers transfer their understanding of ICAP in both the design of the lesson plan, which is study 1 on the left, and in implementation, which is question asking in level 2. So what you will notice that mostly they ask active questions and they design active directives, right? Even after PD, that's what they do mostly, 68% and 58%. So the conclusion is that we had some success changing teachers' design implementation with minimal PD. It's online or it's only 2-day face-to-face. But the minimal change was enough to improve students' learning in the classroom for both studies. You don't know how hard that is to get significant difference in learning classroom. So there is more room to improve, no doubt. Now the problem is that we're expecting teachers to transfer their learning of ICAP or whatever they have to learn to dynamic behavioral implementation in class in real time. Such transfer, any kind of transfer is difficult. Transfer from problem solving to problem solving is difficult. What asks them to transfer from learning something to behavioral implementation? And that's really difficult. And teachers' misunderstanding collaborative interaction was really our fault because back then we didn't know how to explain it in the PD clearly. And only in the middle of the project did we realize that ICAP can code dialogue patterns. So we might want to try that next time. And as you know, this kind of research is very iterative. So you learn something, you change, you learn something, you change. Now, can we use ICAP as a summary to provide a coherent interpretation and comments on the benefits of the 6 principles from the IES practice guide? No, so since the IES practice guide, a lot of people are excited about this robust finding or list of these things. So there is a dean's committee, for example, trying to add to this list, you know, there are now probably up to 20 to 30 things. So let's think about this from the ICAP's perspective, from the student's perspective. How to enhance memory? First, using quizzes is better more often than not doing it multiple times. Well, you can say more active plus active is better than active, right? A and A is more than A. But in fact, to help teachers enhance students' memory is practically unnecessary. Based on our data, teachers' activities are already mostly active. We don't need to tell them anymore. We don't need to tell them to literally space learning over time. They can do a matching task. They have a number of tasks, a large number of interesting tasks. They're all to enhance memory. It just so happened psychologists and other researchers do space learning over time, right? But that's not something they don't know how to do. They don't know how to do space learning, but they know how to enhance active. How to design structured activity. Interleave work example solution or problem solving. Well, that one's easy. You have passive, constructive, because when you solve problems, you're constructive. That's clearly better than passive. How to teach with respect to two forms of representation. Well, that's easy too. Two forms of representation actually support inference generation, so you're actually constructive. Kirsten Butcher's work on her dissertation showed that, and I assume integrating abstract and concrete representation serves the same purpose. And we already know how to ask deep questions, elicit self-explanation and other kinds of explanation, and students are clearly constructive, and we already show how they're deeper. So ICAP can, as summary, it can be and has been generalized for research purposes. For example, we've used it to code, others have used to code tutors, and we've used to code teachers' questions. We've used it to code dialogue patterns. And it turns out, for example, mind wandering, you could detect mind wandering, and it falls off in exactly the ICAP order. There's less and less mind wandering as you go from P to I. And we have designed new learning environments. For example, the observing tutorial video was based on an ICAP prediction because the bystanders was passive. And when we make the bystanders constructive, then the bystanders learn just as much. But ICAP can serve as a comprehensive lens to analyze many components of practice. We can help teachers design plans, activities, evaluate their question asking implementation. One of my students thinking about using this rubric to evaluate teacher, because there's really no good rubric to evaluate whether you're a good teacher or not. We can help teachers design deeper assessment questions, which they have great difficulty with. We can assess students' collaborative dialogue and evaluate education softwares. So our translation goal for teachers and instructors is to understand a coherent framework, such as ICAP, so they can generalize applications of the framework themselves, hopefully. Thank you. Should I just cut this?